The night was quiet, too quiet for a nation that had just celebrated peaceful elections. Then the silence broke. Gunfire echoed across the streets of Dar es Salaam. Mothers hid their children under beds. Reporters whispered that police were changing into civilian clothes. Tanzania, once the calm heart of East Africa, had just entered the storm. They called it a victory, but for whom, within hours of President Samia Suluhu Hassan being declared the winner of one of the most disputed elections in Tanzania's history, the world began to turn its eyes toward her. Videos surfaced of election officials stuffing ballot boxes, opposition figures vanished, and a journalist was shot dead at close range. The streets smelled not of freedom, but of fear. In Washington, the United States Senate was no longer silent. Led by Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee issued an urgent warning. The Tanzanian government has endangered its citizens and undermined democracy. The U.S.-Tanzania relationship must now be reviewed. That statement sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, because when America says review, the world hears sanctions. And when a superpower starts asking questions, even the walls of a presidential palace begin to shake. But beyond the political theater lies something deeper, a moral question. How many lives must be lost before power listens? Can democracy still mean anything if ballots are written in blood? And will the United States act out of conscience or convenience now that China stands at Tanzania's door? This is not just another African story. It's a test of justice, sovereignty, and truth in a world where silence has become complicity. If you believe the world deserves to see what's really happening in Tanzania, please share this video, and subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. It began as a celebration. Balloons, campaign songs, posters of Samia Suluhu Hassan smiling under the Tanzanian sun. People lined up in long queues under mango trees, believing they were part of something historic, a peaceful transition that would define their nation's future. But as dusk fell, that hope began to fade. In the northern town of Talima, a man recorded a short video on his phone, one that would later shake the entire country. It showed election commissioners marking stacks of ballot papers for Samia Suluhu, sealing them and quietly sliding them into ballot boxes before polling even began. In the background, you could hear a voice whispering in Swahili, "Why are you doing this?" These votes were not cast by the people. That clip spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media in Tanzania exploded with similar footage, people counting votes before midnight, papers stamped in the dark, soldiers standing guard outside polling centers. And yet the official results came out the next morning. Samia Suluhu Hassan had won by a landslide. The streets of Mwanza and Dar es Salaam erupted not in joy, but in disbelief. Opposition supporters poured into the streets carrying placards that read, "Haki yetu, our right." They sang, they cried. They demanded transparency. Then came the gunfire. Witnesses described unmarked cars speeding into residential neighborhoods, men in civilian clothes stepping out and shooting into the air, and sometimes not into the air at all. Houses were raided, families dragged outside. One local journalist from Clouds Media, who had been live streaming the protests, was shot dead at point-blank range. His final words were, "They're coming. They're inside the compound." Within 24 hours, dozens of civilians were dead. Videos showed bodies scattered along narrow alleys, mothers weeping beside their sons. Tanzania. The land once praised by the UN as a beacon of peace had turned into a nightmare no one wanted to believe. At the city morgue, a worker whispered to a foreign correspondent, "We stopped counting after 50. The government called it a necessary operation against violent mobs. But the people knew better. They whispered another word, cover-up. As night returned, the fear deepened. The government cut off mobile networks in several regions. Journalists were warned to keep quiet for their own safety. Internet connections slowed to a crawl, but silence could not erase the blood on the ground. And yet amid all the chaos, something new began to emerge, a voice from within the people. In a viral clip, an elderly woman stood outside a church in Dodoma holding a candle and saying, "If our votes are stolen, our faith will not be. We will stand even if the earth trembles." That moment, small as it seemed, was a turning point. It became a symbol of defiance for millions watching from across Africa. Because this was not only about Tanzania, it was about what happens when a nation loses its voice and the world stays silent. By the third day, tension gripped every major city. Rumors spread that international observers had been denied access to polling stations. Civil society leaders went missing. The opposition's legal petitions were rejected overnight. And in Washington, whispers began circulating through diplomatic hallways. What is happening in Tanzania? The answer was already clear to those on the ground. A democracy once admired had been hijacked in plain sight, and a woman once seen as the face of progress had become the symbol of betrayal. For the Tanzanian people, this was not just an election, it was a wound, and for the rest of the world, it was a warning. When the blood dried on the streets of Dar es Salaam, the cameras turned toward Washington. What began as a domestic election dispute was now becoming an international confrontation. The United States Senate had taken notice. Inside the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chaired by Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the mood was heavy. She didn't mince her words. The Tanzanian government has endangered its citizens, undermined its institutions, and betrayed the trust of its people. The U.S.-Tanzania relationship must now be reviewed. Those few sentences carried by every major American network hit like a thunderclap. In diplomatic language, review is the polite word for sanctions, visa bans, and frozen assets. For Samia Suluhu Hassan and her ruling CCM party, the message was clear: Washington was watching. But the reaction inside Tanzania was anything but calm. Across the nation, anger mixed with disbelief. The government spokesperson accused foreign powers of fabricating lies to destabilize Tanzania. In the same breath, they arrested several journalists who had shared the videos of police violence. Meanwhile, the opposition released a joint statement from exile calling Samia Suluhu an illegitimate president imposed on a bleeding nation. The footage of election officials stuffing ballots resurfaced this time, played on big screens in Nairobi, Kampala, and Accra. Africa was watching too. Then came a night that would change everything. Dozens of masked police officers raided the homes of known activists in Dar es Salaam and Morogoro. Gunfire lit up the skyline. Videos showed people being dragged from their houses, screaming names of their loved ones. For the first time, the Tanzanian people began to talk openly about the regime's hit squads. A witness whispered to a BBC reporter, "They wear jeans and sneakers. They look like us, but they kill like soldiers." Within 72 hours, international condemnation poured in. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even the United Nations Human Rights Council called for independent investigations. European diplomats in Nairobi hinted at travel bans and suspension of aid. But the most symbolic response came from Washington, the Senate's call for immediate reassessment of bilateral programs, a clear signal that the U.S. was ready to turn economic pressure into a weapon. Inside Tanzania, fear morphed into fury. In the town of Salaam, hundreds of young men and women filled the streets with handmade signs. "We are not rebels. We are Tanzanians." Their chants echoed through social media. "Wa justice" for Tanzania trended for the first time. Yet amid the rising defiance, the government doubled down. Police surrounded major universities, shutting down campuses under national security pretexts. Several Catholic and Lutheran leaders who spoke against the killings were silenced. And still the voices grew louder. A defiant preacher in Mwanza said during his Sunday sermon, "If the government fears the truth, then the truth itself has become a crime." By this point, the crisis was no longer only political, it had become spiritual. The country was divided between those who still believed in Samia's message of stability and those who saw her as a puppet of foreign interests. At the same time, Washington's decision to act seemed complicated by geopolitics. Tanzania's deepening alliance with China, especially through the Bagamoyo port project, had already irritated U.S. strategists. For some in the Senate, the election crisis provided the perfect excuse to weaken Beijing's foothold in East Africa. And so two battles unfolded simultaneously, one for democracy, the other for dominance. In Dar es Salaam, citizens were fighting for their lives. In Washington, politicians were calculating their moves. But for the people of Tanzania, the question was heartbreakingly simple. Who will protect us if our own government won't, and the world only cares when China is involved? That question hung in the air like smoke. It marked the emotional climax of Tanzania's darkest week, a nation caught between bullets and diplomacy, between truth and survival. And as dawn broke again over the Indian Ocean, the streets of Dar es Salaam were quiet once more. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, but the silence that comes right before another storm. By the end of that week, Tanzania was no longer the same nation the world had known. The country that once welcomed tourists with open arms now carried the smell of burnt tires and tear gas. The crisis had moved beyond the ballot box. It had entered every home, every heart, every conversation whispered in fear. Markets that once bustled with laughter fell silent. Fishermen in Zanzibar refused to go to sea, fearing raids by the Coast Guard. In Arusha, bus drivers hung small white flags on their windshields, a silent plea for peace. The nation's rhythm, once steady and proud, now pulsed with anxiety. The economic impact came fast and hard. Within days of the U.S. Senate statement, several aid programs were suspended pending review. The Tanzanian shilling fell sharply against the dollar. Foreign investors paused contracts, including a $400 million port expansion project. For ordinary citizens, it meant empty shelves and rising prices. Cooking oil tripled in cost. Fuel shortages left highways eerily quiet. But while the economy collapsed, trust in leadership collapsed even faster. Civil servants began resigning in quiet protest. University professors refused to teach classes under surveillance. Even within the ruling party, CCM murmurs of dissent grew louder. Some MPs were said to be secretly reaching out to mediators in the African Union, seeking a way to save the government from itself. In the villages, the wounds ran deeper. Families of the dead demanded justice, but were told to keep silent for national unity. Mothers buried their sons at night under curfew. A teacher from Mwanza wrote on social media before her account vanished. "We used to teach our children that democracy means choice. Now, democracy means mourning." Her words spread far beyond Tanzania's borders. At the same time, religious institutions, once the moral anchors of society, found themselves under pressure. Churches were warned not to politicize the pulpit. Imams who prayed for the dead were accused of inciting unrest. The National Council of Clergy issued a carefully worded statement: "When peace demands silence, truth becomes dangerous." Those words captured the despair of an entire generation. Meanwhile, regional politics began to shift. Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania's closest neighbors, quietly tightened border security. The African Union sent observers but avoided condemnation, fearing a diplomatic split among member states. Yet, behind closed doors, African diplomats whispered about the risk of a Kenya 2007 scenario, a political implosion spilling into neighboring nations. Inside, the military tension brewed. Reports emerged of officers refusing to fire on civilians. A leaked memo suggested that several commanders had called for an internal inquiry into the shootings. That memo never saw daylight again. The once proud image of President Samia Suluhu Hassan, the calm woman in the hijab, seen as a symbol of peace and progress, was now deeply tarnished. Her face, once printed on billboards celebrating women's leadership, became the image of a regime accused of betrayal. And yet, in the midst of despair, a flicker of resilience remained. Across towns and villages, people painted murals on broken walls. Haki haitazimwa, justice cannot be silenced. For the Tanzanian people, the elections were no longer about victory or defeat. They had become a mirror, reflecting the cost of silence, the fragility of power, and the courage of those who dare to remember. The storm had shaken the nation to its core. But in that wreckage, one question still burned like a candle. If justice cannot be found in the ballot, will it one day be found in the hearts of the people? When news of the killings reached Western media outlets, the images were almost too familiar. Tear gas over a ballot box, soldiers in unmarked trucks, a leader denying everything. Yet this time, the name of the country stunned many Americans. Tanzania, a place once praised as Africa's quiet success story. In Washington, the U.S. Senate's call to review relations with Tanzania became the headline that shaped global discourse. The question on Capitol Hill was no longer whether something terrible had happened, it was whether the United States had the moral authority to respond. Behind closed doors, the debate was fierce. Some senators argued that sanctions were necessary not just to punish the regime, but to send a message that America still stands for democratic values. Others warned that too much pressure might drive Tanzania further into the arms of China, a strategic rival already investing billions in the Bagamoyo port and lithium mining projects across the country. At the State Department, the dilemma was clear: should the U.S. act on principle or play the geopolitical game? Meanwhile, in Beijing, Chinese officials defended President Samia's government, accusing Washington of weaponizing human rights for strategic advantage. A spokesperson for China's foreign ministry stated, "Every nation has its own path to stability. Foreign interference will only create more chaos." It was a statement carefully designed to resonate across Africa, especially among governments wary of Western criticism. In Brussels, the European Union adopted a softer tone calling for independent investigations, but avoiding the word sanctions. The African Union, cautious as ever, promised dialogue, though its silence was deafening to Tanzanians still burying their dead. And yet amid this diplomatic theater, a deeper conversation began to unfold among ordinary people in the West. Church groups in Texas, Chicago, and New York held vigils for Tanzanian journalists killed in the crackdown. African diaspora communities demanded accountability, asking would the world care more if this happened in Europe. For the first time, Tanzania's tragedy was forcing a painful reckoning about Western double standards. When a European leader rigged an election, it was called a democratic irregularity. But when an African leader did the same, the continent was labeled unstable. Meanwhile, on social media, African youth from Ghana to South Africa echoed a sentiment once voiced by Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim. Africa does not need pity, it needs partners who respect its people's will. That quote went viral again, linking Tanzania's crisis to the broader awakening sweeping across the continent, an awakening driven by the demand for real sovereignty, not scripted democracy. In the corridors of power, analysts began calling it the Tanzania test. Would the U.S. use its influence to defend principles or to protect interests? Would China exploit the chaos to strengthen its foothold? And would Africa, tired of both, finally decide to stand on its own? As one veteran diplomat put it, the world's response to Tanzania will reveal not who Samia is, but who we are. That single sentence captured the essence of this global moment. Because behind every statement, every sanction, and every silence lies a question that goes far beyond East Africa. Does the world still believe in justice or only in power? The dust has not yet settled over Dar es Salaam. Shattered glass still glitters on the sidewalks where children once played. Mothers still whisper their sons' names into the night, hoping someone somewhere will listen. Tanzania is wounded, but its story is far from over. What began as a stolen election has become something larger, a mirror held up to the world. It reflects the fragility of power, the hypocrisy of nations, and the unbearable cost of silence. For every citizen forced to whisper, there is a government that fears the truth. For every candle lit in remembrance, there is a hand that tries to snuff it out. The question now is not just about Samia Suluhu Hassan or Tanzania. It is about all of us. How many times must the world watch innocent people die before it learns that democracy cannot be built on fear? How many more leaders will hide behind slogans of peace while ruling through the barrel of a gun? The international community has choices to make, but so do the people. Because if Tanzania falls deeper into the darkness, it won't be because the world didn't know. It will be because the world chose not to act. And perhaps that is why voices like Ibrahim Traore's in Burkina Faso have begun to echo so powerfully across Africa, calling for dignity, accountability, and sovereignty, born not from Western approval, but from the will of the people themselves. From Niamey to Dar es Salaam, from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, a quiet revolution is growing, one that demands leaders who serve, not rule. The coming months will decide Tanzania's fate. Will it heal through justice or collapse under denial? Will the United States and the African Union stand for truth or trade it away for strategic comfort? For those of us watching, there is only one moral position left to speak, because silence is not neutrality, silence is permission. So tonight, as the lights dim across a shaken nation, remember, this democracy is not a gift from the powerful, it is a promise kept by the brave. If you believe that truth deserves a voice, share this story. If you believe that justice belongs to every human being, not just the privileged few, stay with us, subscribe, and help amplify these voices that refuse to be silenced. Because what happens in Tanzania today will define what the world becomes tomorrow.